This Thursday marks 5 years since the deadly mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. According to the most recent CBS News poll, 1/3 of Americans believe gun violence in the U.S. has reached a crisis level. CBSN sent a team down to Colorado Springs to hear more on the controversial gun control debate.
I have a question for you, actually, and I want to understand, when you're carrying, I don't know if you open carry or I think you said concealed carry, but do you ever consider what another person's perspective might be of you if they realize that you're carrying and how it makes them feel?
You know, that's...
Does it make you feel as though you perhaps pose a threat to them? Do you ever consider that perspective?
But if I conceal and you don't know...
Sure, but well, I mean, like, so it would have to be a unique situation
even
where they see, you know, your waistband.
So even for me, Colorado being the open state that it is, I get uncomfortable at the sight of somebody open carrying because I feel like I don't know their mentality. I guess I would feel safer with somebody who's concealed carrying and just keeping to themselves. With open carry, I think one, why do you feel the need to open carry?
Seems to instill a sense of bravado that I
yeah,
don't understand.
to me, because I've never seen a woman open carry. It always seems to be a guy that open carries. Okay, what are you trying to prove? I have
Feels
nothing.
aggressive.
Yeah, I don't think anybody needs to have an open carry. I'm not going to take that right away from anybody. I don't see the point behind it, I guess.
I agree. I think it heightens situations awkwardly. It escalates things where you're suddenly very aware that there is someone in the room with a gun.
Because if you were standing next to me and you were standing next to somebody that was open carrying, they're the threat. Now in my head I'm saying they're the threat too, possibly. Meanwhile, nobody's looking at me as the threat.
That's true. That's a good point.
It's a very interesting go around.
It's a unique way to look at it.
Oh, it's a fascinating conversation. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. So, Anthony, a significant percentage of the population thinks that we've hit crisis levels. 69% of Americans believe that gun violence is very serious. Break those numbers down for us.
Well, one of the things that pops out at you is the gender gap in those numbers. So women are much more likely than men to say that they think it's reached a crisis level. But then you get beyond that, and if you say if it's at least a problem, then you get even more widespread belief that it is. Where people tend to break off, of course, is then what do we do about it? What can be done about it? And there we get very different views, although I think what you just saw in that clip is instructive in that you saw people having a conversation and starting to see some commonalities there. When you look at the numbers, people often go into their respective camps very quickly on all this, but it doesn't get to that level of conversation.
Yeah, that's why I found that conversation so illuminating, because I never even considered what someone who carries a gun, how they feel about someone who open carries versus what they're doing. What they're doing is okay, but the way that guy carries his gun is a completely different thing. We never talk like that. It's nice to hear that. So in regards to what can be done, often we talk about background checks, we talk about limiting access to certain guns. According to your poll, people like the idea of background checks by and large, but when it comes to other restrictive laws restricting access, it's not necessarily across the board in agreement.
Right. In most policy matters, you see big partisan splits, Republicans versus Democrats on a lot of things. But background checks gets much wider appeal, in large part because many Republicans also agree with the idea. That hews to a larger concept that many Republicans and many conservatives hold, which is that it's the person and not the weapon. And that's what they tell us. So in their view, if you unpack it a little bit, looking at a background check means you're trying to identify the bad person, identify the folks who might do something wrong with a gun and not be responsible with it. Of course, the counterpoint to that, people say, is, well, people change. And so that might not be effective. However, at the same time, you really do see that wide appeal for background checks, much more so than particular things regarding ammunition, things regarding assault weapons.
After the Las Vegas massacre, suddenly we all learned about bump stocks. Many of us didn't know about them before, that can turn essentially a semi-automatic weapon essentially into an automatic weapon and do much more damage. And of course the argument was, if you didn't have access to this, then maybe the shooting would have still occurred, but the number of people killed may not have. And according to your numbers, people are not that crazy about these individual measures.
Right, and what you see is those splits. You see those partisan splits. That goes for assault weapons. It goes for bump stocks. Where you also see people commonly thinking something could make a difference is mental health screening. Because here again, it goes back to that idea of a person versus the weapon. People also tend to get lost in the details of all of this when you talk about it, right? So a bump stock versus an assault weapon. What is an assault weapon? Those poll questions kind of gloss over a lot of those details, and makes it hard for people to decide which should work and which might not. Right. So you do see those big differences. But again, it's really been this partisan divide that we've seen throughout this. As soon as a tragedy happens, people kind of retreat to their respective corners, and we've often seen after one, folks go, okay, well, it's this cause or it's that cause, and not really coming to any kind of understanding.
Yeah, it's sort of a grand irony, because every time something like this happens, there is a renewed conversation about gun laws and gun violence in this country, and we keep thinking that a tragedy will bring this country together on that topic, and you're saying not necessarily the case at all, because people sort of go back to their corners. You ask them, well, what do we do? What should we do about gun violence, and what sort of responses did you get? Well,
you get those splits. Mental health screenings are a big one that comes up that people think could be effective. We talked about background checks, but the rest of them, where you talk about what kinds of weapons could be prohibited, one of the concerns that a lot of folks on the right say is, well, if you start down that slippery slope, if you start prohibiting this kind of weapon, then they fear that the rest of them will be taken away. And then, of course, the folks who are in favor of gun control say, well, there's got to be some kind of compromise there, right? A handgun versus a rifle versus what they consider an assault weapon. So you get these particulars where you get a lot of differences about what it is that could actually make a difference.
It's really fascinating. It seems the more we talk about this subject, the more we are a divided nation on it. And you would think that conversation would bring unity, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the case. The divisions are the same divisions that have always been there, it seems like, over the past decade or so.
Because people don't agree on what the root causes are. Right. So you see this large consensus that it is a problem, but if you don't agree on the root causes, you don't know how to address it. And that's sort of the starting point for a lot of the division.
Very fascinating. I love the snapshot that you give us in numbers of where we are in this country. Anthony Salvanto, thank you so much.
Thanks, Emery.
And you can see more of the gun conversation debate Thursday night during our special report, Mass Shootings 5 Years After Sandy Hook, right here on CBSN at 8 p.m. Eastern.